The story of the murder of Carol Dimitri Stewart that I am talking about today may give you a glimpse into the nature of people, and that what we see sometimes is completely different from the truth. The important thing is not to treat our expectations and impressions as fixed truth. A dazzling wedding ceremony was held at St. James's Church between a fur company manager named Charles Stewart, born on December 18, 1959, and his girlfriend, the famous lawyer Carol Dimitri, born on March 26, 1959. The two lovers met while working at Dreetfood in 1980 while studying at university. Charles, a handsome young man who had just won a football scholarship, was working as a chef, while Carol was working as a waitress. Naturally, the wealthy Boston couple were the center of attention and envy of those around them, as they were a role model for success on both the personal and professional levels. The happiness of the lucky couple was complete, for years after their marriage, when they received the news that the family would be increased by one, and it would be their first child. Congratulations and warm wishes poured in from all family members. Carol announced that she would devote her attention to raising and caring for her upcoming son and would take a break from work for some time, especially since her husband alone earned about $100,000 annually from managing the fur company, which was a considerable amount at the time. On October 23, 1989, Charles and Carol attended a childbirth class at Bingham Hospital, and that familiarity with the smallest details of the birth process, such as the normal size of the fetus and the like. During that period, Charles and his wife Carol were exchanging looks and smiles with obvious happiness, and after the end of the chapter, they left together, holding hands, and made their way through the Roxbury neighborhood in Boston to return home. While their car was stopped at a traffic light, a black man with a hoarse voice wearing a tracksuit suddenly burst into the car. The couple were terrified, and Charles asked him what he wanted, but the man shouted at him asking him to go to the Mission Hill area. The husband complied with the orders, swallowing his saliva in fear for his life and the life of Carol and their little child who had not yet seen the light of the sun of this world. When they took him to the desired area, the black man robbed them. When they thought they would be released, he pointed his gun at them and shot Carol in the head, while Charles was shot in the stomach, then fled, while they were covered in blood. With great effort, the bereaved couple managed to raise their hands and dial the emergency number from their car phone, barely speaking in a gasping voice. "My wife was shot. I was shot. Man, I'm going to pass out. It hurts." My wife stopped complaining and stopped breathing. Police went to the scene, and a Rescue 911 reality TV crew happened to be in a car with Boston EMS personnel, and they were able to film the bloody scene of the car covered in blood while police and paramedics helped Charles and his wife. Carol was rushed to the operating room at the same Brigham Hospital where she had been with her husband, just hours before the accident. But they failed to save her life and she died early the next morning from her injuries. The baby was born by cesarean section 2 months early and was named Christopher. There was hope that he would survive, but he only lasted 17 days before he too died from shock and lack of oxygen. Joining his mother. As for the bereaved Charles, he was staying in another hospital receiving shock after shock, from the loss of his wife and infant child, not to mention his critical health condition and undergoing 2 surgeries, to be released from the hospital after 6 weeks. Still suffering from the side effects of the 2 operations, but he still fought hard to stand firm to witness with his own eyes the person who destroyed his life receiving the punishment he deserved. Carol was buried while he was still in the hospital, but while receiving treatment he wrote her a brief eulogy to be read at her funeral, in which he bid farewell to his beloved, "Sleep with the angels, my love." While Charles was in the hospital, and before he recovered, the police were turning the city upside down in search of the family's attacker. People's voices rose to re-implement the death penalty. More than 100 policemen went to comb all the mixed neighborhoods in search of the perpetrator. Some black men suffered from constant stopping and searching because they largely fit the descriptions Charles described. Consequently, there were over 150 arrests in the poor black neighborhoods, until the first suspect was arrested, a man named Alan Swanson. He was homeless and lived in the housing projects that were still under construction. Although the resemblance between the attacker and Alan was not very strong, the presence of a tracksuit in his possession that was identical to the one the suspect was wearing at the time of the attack and the poor man's condition and homelessness made all eyes turn to him unjustly. And so he remained in custody, until a man who fit the description and criminal record from Allen appeared and they released him in November. The man arrested in the shooting incident was Willie Demmitt, a criminal with a long history of street fights and armed robbery. The last time he was in prison was when he recklessly shot a police officer while robbing video game stores. As for his features, there is no harm in it. The man resembles the suspect to a great extent. Now, all they have to do is show him to Charles, and the file on this tragic case will be closed once and for all. As for the poor man Charles, who was still bedridden in the hospital at the time, the police, despite his poor health and psychological condition, were very keen to achieve justice for him and his murdered wife, so they visited him and showed them a picture of the suspect, and he showed them a strong reaction upon seeing him, and so, to be completely sure, they decided to wait until he recovered so that they could see the suspect face to face. The police detained Willie Demmitt, despite his mother's protests and her repeated pleas that her son had not committed what they accused him of. How could he, when he was not in town on that very day? However, in any case, the public sighed in relief, as the perpetrator of this heinous crime fell into the hands of justice, to finally close the curtain on this terrible tragedy. Once the just and deterrent verdict was issued, only one person at that time was running his hands over his face nervously, and guilt was devouring his heart, as he asked himself insistently, denouncing what the hell I did. And this person was none other than Matthew Stewart, Charles's brother, whose conscience tormented him and flogged him mercilessly, until he finally submitted to it, and began to tell his family everything. Then he voluntarily went to the police station on January 3, 1990, and confessed to them what would turn the whole case upside down. We can say that greed is the real key to that unfortunate incident in which that wealthy, self-made woman was a victim. As a tax lawyer, Carol received a large sum of money, and contributed the lion's share of it to the expenses of the house. So, when she announced her pregnancy, her husband Charles suspected that she would stop working for good, and with her the generous flow of money necessary for the luxurious life that he could not live even a little less than. He was not fond of Carol to the point of wanting children from her, and he was even having an affair with another woman inside the fur company where he worked. He made no effort to hide his true feelings about his wife's pregnancy, and kept quarreling with her all the time until she miscarried, and she always responded with the same categorical refusal, and insisted that she kept it. When he finally despaired of her, he pretended to submit and accept the reality, so that no one would notice their differences until he found a solution. The idea came to him in the form of a terrifying idea, to get rid of her and her fetus, in order to remove a heavy burden from his shoulders, and at the same time the insurance money would be his share after her death. Who better than his 23-year-old brother Matthew to partner with in this fateful operation for $10,000? It is true that doubts had crossed his mind about the possibility of betraying him. He is well aware of how weak his personality is, but doesn't he also need some money to alleviate his financial crises that he is suffering under? At first, Matthew thought that his brother Charles would claim that the jewelry was stolen and demand the insurance amount. 2 days before the incident, the latter took his wife for a walk and took her to a jewelry store and bought her a gift from there in an attempt to confirm his fake love. As we learned at the beginning of our story, he took her to the hospital to continue playing the role of the ideal husband on the one hand, and to implement his malicious plan on the other hand. On the way back, he deliberately headed to an area crowded with African Americans, taking advantage of the spread of racism and discrimination, and confident that no one would doubt his words later. He stopped the car and shot his wife, then himself, risking losing his life. Before calling 911, his brother waited in his car until he arrived, and Charles handed him a bag from the window containing a gun, his and his wife's wedding rings, and some jewelry that Carol wore. Matthew took it and threw it off the Pines River Bridge, which was later found by the police. Once Charles knew that Matthew had confessed to everything that had happened, he got into his car and drove to the middle of the Mystic Bridge. He got out and wrote a note saying that he could not deal with the accusations against him. He then immediately jumped into the river from a height of about 145 feet to die, and rescuers recovered his body the next day. With the death of Charles Stewart, Willie Demmitt was acquitted. This was after witnesses told the jury that the police had pressured them to identify Demmitt, so he was released. But he was soon back in prison after committing an armed robbery in Brooklyn and was sentenced to 12 years, and was released in 2002. Willie later said, "I know I didn't do it, and they know I didn't do it, and if Matthew hadn't confessed, there was no doubt in my mind that I would have ended up in prison for Carol's murder. I have nothing to say about this man, Demmitt said of Charles. "He's a monster. He did what he did and now he's gone. I'll see him in hell, if there is a hell." Charles's brother Matthew was convicted in 1991 of obstruction of justice and insurance fraud, lost his career and died in a homeless shelter on September 3, 2011, of an overdose of alcohol and cocaine. Carroll's headstone, along with his son Christopher, was changed to Carroll's maiden name, Demmitt, at Holy Cross Cemetery in Malden. Her family created the Carroll Demmitt Stewart Foundation, which was created specifically to provide college scholarships to students from the Mission Hill area, Demmitt said of Charles. And here we have reached the end of the story. I hope you liked it. Frankly, I liked the story and it was very shocking, so I hope you don't forget to like and subscribe.